Well, good evening, Bev. I think what this heightens the possibility of is the Russians doing something that would then allow them to escalate this war against the Ukrainians. The US administration and others have warned that the Russians may do something using chemical weapons to give them the pretext to get a breakthrough in this war that has so far clearly eluded them.
You have spoken of how Russia has upended war to a degree, and we're seeing this playing out. We saw it in Syria with the ongoing, there were chemical attacks there, where there were continual attacks on civilians. This is the same thing that is happening, playing out in Ukraine by all accounts. In terms of the theatre of war, how do you see this? Does it constitute war crimes?
Well, I think we'd have to look at it in detail, but if the Russians are deliberately targeting civilians, it doesn't matter whether they're chemical or conventional weapons, they're against the laws of armed conflict. Clearly, in the first couple of days, the Russians tried to win this war fast, cheap and easy with light forces and a rapid seizure of Kiev. That didn't happen, and now 2 weeks into this war, President Putin and his senior military commanders are getting increasingly desperate for some kind of success they can sell to their own people. What we're seeing with this manoeuvring around false flag operations using chemical weapons is just part of those manoeuvres.
So tell me, in terms of the way this has played out for Russia, they become increasingly desperate. The air war has not been as successful as it might have been for them. How do you view the air war, and do you think there should be greater support for Ukraine?
Well, the Russians were clearly very arrogant in going in without having air supremacy over Ukraine. I mean, it's unthinkable that a Western force would do that. I think it goes to the delusional strategy that Putin has tried to implement here, that they thought they could win this war quickly and cheaply. And the air war is just an indicator of that. When it comes to, I guess you're referring to no-fly zones, I think NATO and the United States have been very clear that they don't believe that is a viable option. One, because it escalates the risk of war with Russia and NATO and the United States. It escalates the potential for Russia to strike targets outside of Ukraine, but also it's unlikely to reduce the level of civilian casualties the Ukrainians are suffering, because most of those are coming from rockets, artillery and other forces on the ground.
So let's talk about the push to Kiev. What is your sense of whether Russia have the troops on the ground to finally get control of Kiev?
Well, for the last couple of weeks, a lot of commentators, including myself, have been saying, well, it's early days yet. It's early days yet. But 2 weeks into this, the Russians have not made significant progress against Kiev. I mean, clearly they seek to surround the city first and induce some kind of surrender by bombing it and rocketing it into submission. But they haven't surrounded it. That's not in prospect anytime soon. I mean, this war is actually rapidly approaching a form of stalemate.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So, I mean, we see talks tonight where the Russian narrative doesn't move. They keep talking about the atrocities, the Nazification of Ukraine and the militarization of Ukraine. So we're not seeming to move away from that. If it is becoming a stalemate, how, in your view, will the two sides meet some common ground or find some common ground?
Well, I think the Russians will want to take as much ground as they can possibly get before they go into any kind of negotiations. I mean, most ceasefire agreements that happen during wars, people get to keep the ground they've already got. We've seen that over the last century. So the Russians will be playing for time to try and do that. At the same time, the Russians actually don't have a lot of time. They will be bled white by the Ukrainians, whether it's in a conventional fight or some kind of insurgency, or even a combination of two over the coming weeks and months.
From what you've observed of Vladimir Putin, and he does seem to be under siege at the moment and under enormous pressure, he's not a man to back away from a fight, though, is he?
No, and as a lot of senior US people testified before the Congress this week, including the director of the CIA and other senior people, I mean, whilst he's been proven wrong on a lot of the assumptions he went into the war with, he's not going to back down. That means this war is going to continue to escalate, and there are some very dark days ahead, I'm afraid.
And do you think, though, too, the approach of the Ukrainians at the moment, I mean, they are putting up an enormous fight. Will they be able to keep that up, considering the humanitarian cost?
There is a tremendous humanitarian cost to what's happening, but remember, it's the Russians who are doing this. The Ukrainians are defending their own ground. That gives soldiers and civilians in Ukraine tremendous heart and great purpose. They are being led magnificently by a president who pretty much the entirety of the Western analytical community underrated before this war. So with his leadership, with the purpose of defending their own country, and a lot of the Western support that is really starting to flow in now, the Ukrainians have a good chance of fighting the Russians to a standstill.
Fascinating stuff. Mick, appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bev.